For generations Russian tank crews were taught to respect certain threats above all others: heavy anti-tank missiles, attack aircraft, and massed artillery, but small civilian drones were never part of that mental checklist, and when the war in Ukraine began many crews treated the buzzing machines overhead as little more than irritants, toys flown by amateurs, cheap cameras that might spot movement but could never threaten steel measured in tons, composite armor designed to defeat shaped charges, and crews protected by decades of doctrine and confidence. Inside their vehicles soldiers joked about the drones, laughed when they heard the faint electric whine above tree lines, and in some cases even waved at them, convinced that nothing so small and fragile could matter. That belief followed them as they advanced through eastern Ukraine, along cratered roads and muddy tracks where armored units supported infantry and held territory commanders considered secure, and these were not reckless charges but deliberate movements built on the assumption that Ukrainian forces lacked the means to seriously challenge armored vehicles at close range. What the crews did not know was that Ukrainian engineers, hobbyists, and frontline soldiers had already begun quietly rewriting the rules of modern armored warfare, using parts ordered online, knowledge shared in encrypted chat groups, and endless trial and error conducted under fire. They had taken first-person view racing drones and turned them into guided weapons, cheap, precise, and devastating, fitted with explosives, shaped charges, and live video feeds that allowed an operator to fly directly into a target's most vulnerable points: seams, hatches, engine decks, and ammunition storage. Unlike traditional anti-tank weapons, these drones did not announce themselves with smoke trails or launch signatures, and they did not give crews time to react. They arrived low and fast, weaving through trees, skimming fields, and appearing only in the final seconds before impact. At first, losses caused by these drones were dismissed as isolated incidents, bad luck, mechanical failure, or the inevitable chaos of war, but as days turned into weeks the reports kept coming: tanks disabled without warning, crews killed or forced to abandon vehicles after explosions from above, and the pattern became impossible to ignore. Russian commanders attempted to reassure their units, emphasizing discipline, spacing, and vigilance, but the psychological damage was already done, because the enemy was no longer something visible on the horizon or marked on a map. It was invisible, patient, and always watching. Ukrainian drone teams operated from concealed positions, sometimes kilometers away, guided by spotters and real-time intelligence, studying tank movements and crew habits, learning when vehicles slowed, when hatches opened, when engines idled too long, and each of those moments became an opportunity. One afternoon, along a narrow tree-lined road, a Russian tank platoon halted briefly, engines rumbling, as infantry advanced ahead to clear the route, and the crews believed the area was quiet. Reconnaissance reports showed no immediate threats, and the sky appeared empty. Hidden among branches and camouflage netting, a Ukrainian drone operator watched through a grainy live feed, his hands steady on the controls as an FPV drone lifted silently and began its run. The video image showed the rear deck of the lead tank in sharp detail, exhaust grills glowing faintly, bolts and seams clearly visible, and the operator adjusted altitude, corrected course, and committed. Inside the tank the crew heard the sound only at the last moment, a rising buzz that triggered confusion rather than immediate action, and there was no time to react. The drone struck the engine deck and detonated, sending a focused jet of molten metal and flame into the compartment. Alarms screamed, smoke filled the cramped interior, and within seconds the vehicle was disabled. As the crew struggled to escape, secondary explosions followed, fuel ignited, and the tank burned violently in full view of the rest of the platoon. Panic spread instantly, because what had been mocked moments earlier had just destroyed one of their own, and there was no clear way to fight it. Turrets could not elevate fast enough, machine guns struggled to track small agile targets, and firing blindly only revealed positions to artillery. Above all, the crews realized something fundamental had changed. They were vulnerable in ways they had never trained for, and as they scanned the sky in growing fear, more drones were already on the way. The second drone arrived from a direction no one expected, slipping in low over the tree line and rising sharply only in the final seconds, and this time the tank crew spotted it just early enough to understand what was about to happen but not early enough to stop it, because understanding does not equal control, and in modern combat seconds are a luxury rarely afforded. A burst of machine gun fire tore through branches and leaves, but the drone kept coming, guided by a live feed that compensated for every evasive movement, and when it struck the turret ring the explosion jammed the mechanism instantly, turning the tank into an immobile bunker with no way to fight back. Crews in neighboring vehicles abandoned any pretense of formation, some reversing blindly, others pushing forward in panic. Spacing collapsed, radios filled with overlapping shouts, and command authority dissolved under stress. Ukrainian drone operators exploited the chaos with practiced efficiency, coordinating attacks so that drones arrived not individually but in waves, forcing crews to choose between targets they could not track and threats they could not prioritize. One tank attempted to retreat at speed, its engine roaring as it lurched backward, only to be struck from above by a drone that plunged directly into an open hatch, detonating inside the crew compartment and producing a flash so bright it was visible through the smoke. The survivors who managed to escape found themselves exposed on open ground, disoriented and burned, with no clear direction to run and no enemy to shoot at, while artillery observers already adjusted fire based on drone footage, adding another layer of punishment to a situation that was spiraling out of control. What made the experience uniquely terrifying was not just the destruction but the helplessness, because traditional countermeasures failed, smoke offered limited protection, electronic warfare was inconsistent, and the speed of adaptation favored the side willing to improvise. Ukrainian units could lose drones and replace them within hours, while a destroyed tank represented not just lost equipment but lost crews, lost training, and lost confidence. As word of the engagement spread through Russian units in the region, the psychological impact extended far beyond the immediate losses, because every buzzing sound overhead now triggered fear, every shadow in the sky demanded attention, and crews began closing hatches more often, reducing situational awareness and increasing fatigue. Commanders issued new directives: camouflage more thoroughly, deploy anti-drone screens, keep moving, never idle, but these measures were reactive, and the initiative had already shifted. Ukrainian forces understood that they had discovered a lever that allowed them to apply disproportionate force with minimal resources, and they refined it relentlessly, experimenting with different explosives, attack angles, and coordination methods, sharing footage and lessons learned across units with a speed that formal militaries struggled to match. The battlefield became a laboratory, and Russian armor became the test subject. Each engagement reinforced the lesson that armor alone no longer guaranteed dominance. And that technological superiority could be achieved not through expensive systems but through creativity and adaptation. By the time Russian doctrine began to acknowledge the threat in official terms, hundreds of videos circulated online and within military channels showing tanks burning from attacks that cost a fraction of their value, and those images did more damage to morale than any single tactical defeat. Crews who once laughed at drones now scanned the sky with constant tension, knowing that the smallest and cheapest weapon on the battlefield had become one of the deadliest, and that the future of armored warfare had changed not with a roar but with a quiet electric buzz that arrived just before everything went dark. As the war dragged on, that buzzing sound became a defining feature of the front, a constant reminder that the battlefield was no longer governed by the old hierarchy of size and firepower, and Russian tank crews adapted not out of choice but necessity, welding makeshift cages and metal grills over turrets, piling logs and spare track links onto hulls, and experimenting with improvised countermeasures that reflected desperation as much as innovation. These additions added weight, reduced mobility, and complicated maintenance, but crews accepted the trade-off because survival now depended on buying seconds, even fractions of seconds, that might allow a drone to detonate prematurely or glance off at an angle. Ukrainian operators studied these adaptations with the same calm curiosity they had once reserved for unprotected tanks, noting how cages created new weak points, how added weight strained suspensions, and how slower vehicles became easier targets for follow-up attacks. Every solution generated a new problem, and every problem became an opportunity. In one engagement, a tank fitted with a heavy protective cage successfully deflected the first drone, the explosion blossoming harmlessly above the turret, and the crew celebrated prematurely, believing they had finally beaten the threat, only to be struck moments later by a second drone that slipped under the cage and detonated against the hull side, igniting stored ammunition and forcing the crew to abandon the vehicle in flames. That pattern repeated across the front, reinforcing a grim understanding that there was no permanent fix, only temporary mitigation, and that adaptation was a race without a finish line. Ukrainian drone units refined their tactics further, coordinating with artillery, infantry, and electronic warfare teams to overwhelm defenses through saturation and timing rather than brute force. Drones would force tanks to button up and slow down, artillery would exploit reduced mobility, and infantry equipped with traditional anti-tank weapons would close in once crews were disoriented and isolated. This layered approach transformed inexpensive tools into force multipliers, allowing smaller units to punch far above their weight and dictate the tempo of engagements. For Russian crews the psychological toll accumulated steadily, long hours inside cramped vehicles with hatches closed, limited visibility, and constant vigilance drained concentration and morale, mistakes became more frequent, and trust in equipment eroded. Tanks that once symbolized power now felt like coffins on tracks, protective shells that attracted attention rather than deflecting it. Veterans began warning new crews not to underestimate the drones, passing down lessons learned in fire and smoke, but warnings could only go so far when the threat was omnipresent and unpredictable. Meanwhile, Ukrainian operators gained confidence with each successful strike, not out of cruelty but out of necessity, because every destroyed tank reduced pressure on their infantry and bought time for their defenses to hold. Footage of successful attacks was reviewed not for spectacle but for improvement, analyzing angles, approach speeds, and detonation timing, turning each battle into a training exercise for the next. Over time these practices hardened into doctrine, informal at first but increasingly standardized as effectiveness proved undeniable. By the time military analysts and foreign observers began openly discussing the implications, the transformation was already complete. Armored warfare had entered a new phase where visibility and adaptability mattered more than sheer armor thickness, and where the balance between cost and effect favored those willing to innovate quickly. For the Russian side the lesson came at a brutal price, paid in burned-out hulls and lost crews, and for the world watching it became clear that the age of unquestioned armored dominance was over. The quiet civilian technology once dismissed as a toy had forced one of the world's largest armored forces to rethink everything it believed about protection and power, and on battlefields across Ukraine the future announced itself not with the thunder of guns but with the soft persistent buzz of a drone closing in. Long after the smoke cleared from individual engagements the effects of that shift continued to ripple outward, changing how commanders planned movements and how crews experienced every kilometer of ground they crossed, because the presence of drones meant that no pause was truly safe and no concealment was ever complete. Columns began moving more erratically, routes were changed at the last minute, and timetables dissolved into rough estimates, yet these adjustments often created new vulnerabilities, because unpredictability slowed logistics and strained coordination. Ukrainian forces exploited this hesitation, knowing that pressure applied indirectly could be as effective as direct destruction, and that forcing an enemy to doubt its own procedures was a victory in itself. In some sectors tanks were pulled back from frontline roles altogether, reassigned to indirect fire or defensive positions where movement was limited, a quiet admission that the calculus of risk had changed. For crews this felt like a loss of purpose, a reversal of the role they had trained for, and morale suffered accordingly. The psychological dominance once exerted by armored formations diminished as infantry and light units gained confidence, knowing that heavy vehicles no longer guaranteed breakthrough or protection. Ukrainian soldiers spoke of the drones as equalizers, tools that allowed them to face an adversary with superior numbers and equipment on more balanced terms, and that sense of empowerment translated into bolder defensive tactics and more aggressive counterattacks. On the Russian side, attempts to regain the initiative through new technology and centralized countermeasures lagged behind the pace of adaptation at the front, because innovation driven from the top moved slower than improvisation driven by necessity. Each delay cost time, and time favored the side already comfortable operating in this new environment. As months passed, the lessons learned on those roads and fields spread beyond Ukraine, studied by militaries around the world that watched footage once dismissed as propaganda with growing concern. Analysts noted that the cost ratio alone demanded attention, a drone assembled for a few $100s destroying a vehicle worth millions, but the deeper implication was doctrinal, because it challenged assumptions about survivability, crew safety, and the future role of armor in high-intensity conflict. Training manuals would eventually be rewritten, procurement priorities reconsidered, and simulations updated, but those changes would come later, informed by losses already suffered. For the men who lived through the transition, the experience was more immediate and personal, defined by tension, vigilance, and the constant awareness that the smallest mistake could be fatal. The laughter that once followed the sound of drones vanished, replaced by silence and focused listening. And that transformation in attitude marked the true impact of the weapon. What began as mockery ended as respect, earned not through intimidation but through effectiveness, and on those battlefields the lesson was carved into steel and memory alike. In the end, the story of the FPV drone was not just about technology, but about arrogance meeting adaptation, and about how the side willing to question assumptions and experiment under fire reshaped the battlefield while the other paid the price for believing that what had always worked would continue to do so. That price was measured not only in destroyed equipment but in a fundamental erosion of confidence that no amount of propaganda could fully restore, because once a crew understands it is being hunted, not engaged, its relationship with the battlefield changes permanently. Russian tankers began to describe their work not as maneuver warfare but as endurance, long hours spent listening, watching, waiting, and reacting to threats that might never appear yet could strike at any moment. Fatigue accumulated, judgment suffered, and even well-trained crews made errors under the strain, stopping in exposed positions, clustering too closely, or hesitating at critical moments, and each mistake offered Ukrainian operators another opportunity. The drones did not need to destroy every tank to be effective, they only needed to be present often enough to shape behavior, to slow advances, to force caution where speed was once doctrine. Ukrainian commanders understood this dynamic and leaned into it, deploying drones not only for attacks but for constant reconnaissance, keeping pressure on armored units even when no strike was imminent. This persistent presence turned the sky itself into contested terrain, and the psychological effect was cumulative. For Russian leadership the challenge became increasingly complex, because solutions that worked in theory faltered in practice, electronic warfare systems interfered with friendly communications, air defenses struggled to distinguish drones from birds or debris, and every layer added increased complexity without guaranteeing safety. Meanwhile, Ukrainian innovation continued at the edge of necessity, driven by small teams empowered to experiment and share results quickly, a flexibility that allowed tactics to evolve faster than formal countermeasures could keep up. By the time new doctrines began filtering down the chain of command, the battlefield had already moved on, shaped by hundreds of small engagements rather than a single decisive battle. In retrospect, the moment when tank crews laughed at drones stands out as a turning point, not because it marked the beginning of losses, but because it revealed how deeply outdated assumptions can persist until reality intervenes violently. The FPV drone did not win the war on its own, but it exposed a vulnerability that could not be ignored, proving that modern combat favors those who adapt fastest rather than those who cling longest to past certainties. For the crews who survived, the lesson was learned the hard way, etched into memory alongside the sound of buzzing motors and sudden explosions, and for those who did not, it became part of a broader story that will be studied long after the conflict ends. In the end, the drones achieved something more profound than tactical success. They forced a re-evaluation of what power looks like on the modern battlefield, demonstrating that dominance is no longer defined by size or cost alone, but by awareness, ingenuity, and the willingness to see a threat for what it truly is before it is too late. That realization spread unevenly, because institutional change always lags behind battlefield truth, and while some units adapted quickly, others continued to operate as they always had, relying on armor thickness and firepower to compensate for vulnerability, and it was those units that suffered the most. In several documented cases, tanks moved without adequate infantry support, assuming speed and intimidation would suffice, only to be isolated by drones that tracked them relentlessly until an opening appeared. The moment a vehicle paused to refuel, to wait for orders, or to navigate difficult terrain, it became a potential target, and Ukrainian operators learned to wait patiently for exactly those moments. Patience became a weapon in itself, one that cost nothing and yielded devastating results. The contrast between the two approaches was stark, one side burdened by hierarchy and expectation, the other empowered by initiative and necessity, and that contrast played out again and again in the wreckage scattered across fields and roads. As the months passed, the visual language of the war changed. Burned-out tanks with improvised cages became familiar sights, symbols of an adaptation that never quite caught up, and drone footage replaced traditional battlefield reports as the primary record of engagements. These videos were not merely propaganda, they were tactical documents, dissected frame by soldiers and analysts alike, each explosion a data point in an evolving understanding of modern combat. For the crews inside the tanks, the experience remained intensely personal, defined by moments of terror compressed into seconds, followed by long stretches of waiting that stretched nerves to the breaking point. Survival depended less on bravery than on awareness and luck, and the sense of control that once came with sitting behind armor eroded steadily. Ukrainian forces recognized that they had shifted the balance not through a single breakthrough but through cumulative pressure, thousands of small actions that together reshaped how the enemy moved and fought. This approach required discipline and restraint, because drones used carelessly could be wasted, but when employed thoughtfully they became extensions of the operator's intent, precise tools rather than blunt instruments. Over time, this method of warfare proved difficult to counter, because it thrived on uncertainty and punished routine. Looking back, the early laughter of tank crews seems almost surreal, a brief moment when the future was visible but unrecognized, and that moment now serves as a cautionary tale for militaries everywhere. The lesson is not that technology alone decides wars, but that ignoring small changes can have enormous consequences, and that arrogance in the face of adaptation is one of the most reliable paths to defeat. On the battlefields of Ukraine, the FPV drone earned its place not through novelty but through effectiveness, and by the time its significance was fully understood, it had already altered the course of armored warfare in ways that cannot be undone. By the final stages of the campaign in that sector, the presence of tanks had become conditional rather than assumed, deployed cautiously and often only after drone reconnaissance confirmed a temporary window of safety, and even then crews moved with an awareness that protection was fleeting. The once clear distinction between front line and rear dissolved, because drones erased depth, reaching into areas previously considered secure and forcing a redistribution of attention and resources. Supply routes were adjusted, maintenance areas camouflaged, and every concentration of vehicles treated as a potential liability rather than a show of strength. Ukrainian commanders understood that this constant pressure achieved effects that no single strike could replicate, wearing down confidence, slowing decision-making, and forcing the enemy into a reactive posture. For Russian crews, the transformation was complete. The tank was no longer a symbol of dominance but a platform that demanded constant protection from an unseen threat, and the pride once associated with armored service gave way to cautious professionalism tempered by anxiety. The lessons learned in those engagements would ripple outward, influencing training and procurement long after the guns fell silent. Because they revealed a truth that could not be ignored, that adaptability mattered more than tradition and that innovation could emerge from the margins rather than the center. In the quiet moments between missions, Ukrainian operators reflected on how quickly the battlefield had changed, aware that their advantage depended on staying ahead of countermeasures that would inevitably come, and that the race to adapt had no finish line. For the world watching, the story offered a glimpse into the future of conflict, where small teams armed with inexpensive tools could challenge and even neutralize forces built around legacy systems, and where the balance of power could shift through ingenuity rather than sheer mass. The laughter that once echoed over open radio channels at the sound of drones was gone, replaced by a sober understanding shared on both sides, that modern warfare rewards those who learn fastest and punishes those who cling to assumptions forged in another era. In that sense, the FPV drone did more than destroy tanks. It exposed the cost of complacency and the danger of underestimating a threat simply because it did not fit existing models. Long after the last drone returned to its launch point and the last tank burned out along a roadside, that lesson remained, written not in manuals or speeches but in the hard reality of combat, a reminder that in war the smallest things are often the most dangerous when they are ignored. Even as new countermeasures were tested and revised, the fundamental imbalance introduced by the FPV drone remained, because every layer of defense added complexity without eliminating uncertainty, and uncertainty was where the Ukrainians thrived. Russian units could never be sure whether the sky was empty or merely quiet, and that ambiguity shaped every movement, every halt, every decision to advance or withdraw. Over time, the accumulation of these micro-decisions altered operational tempo, slowing advances and compressing timelines until momentum itself became fragile. Ukrainian forces capitalized on this fragility, coordinating drone activity with feints and limited probes that forced armored units to react defensively, expending energy and resources without achieving decisive results. The battlefield became a space where initiative mattered more than mass, and where the ability to impose psychological pressure proved as valuable as physical destruction. For tank crews, the constant vigilance demanded by this environment exacted a toll that no armor upgrade could mitigate, because fatigue eroded performance in subtle ways, narrowing attention, slowing reactions, and amplifying fear. Stories circulated among crews about drones that seemed to appear from nowhere, about near misses and sudden explosions, and these stories reinforced caution even in moments of relative calm. Ukrainian operators understood the power of these narratives and did nothing to dispel them, because fear itself was an effective weapon. As the conflict evolved, the FPV drone became emblematic of a broader shift toward distributed, networked warfare, where information flowed faster than orders and small units could exert outsized influence. This shift challenged traditional command structures and rewarded flexibility, forcing militaries to reconsider how authority and initiative should be balanced in high-intensity conflict. In Ukraine, the consequences of that reassessment were immediate and tangible, measured in burned-out vehicles and abandoned positions, while elsewhere they remained theoretical, studied in classrooms and war games. The contrast underscored a recurring truth of military history, that wars are often decided not by those who possess the most powerful tools, but by those who recognize and exploit change first. The Russian tank crews who once laughed at drones became unwilling participants in that lesson, their experience illustrating how quickly confidence can turn into vulnerability when assumptions go unchallenged. In the end, the story of the FPV drone was not about humiliation or spectacle, but about adaptation under pressure, and about the unforgiving nature of modern battlefields that leave little room for complacency. It was a story written in fragments of metal and moments of realization, and it will endure as a case study in how the smallest innovations can force the largest institutions to confront their own limitations. As analysts later pieced together the timeline of those engagements, a clear pattern emerged, one that mirrored countless moments in military history where an underestimated threat reshaped the battlefield before doctrine could catch up. The FPV drone did not arrive as a revolutionary weapon announced with fanfare, it crept in quietly, adopted by those with the least to lose and the most to gain, and its impact grew precisely because it was ignored at first. Russian armored units, built around assumptions forged in earlier conflicts, found themselves confronting an adversary that refused to fight on familiar terms, and every attempt to impose old frameworks only deepened the mismatch. Ukrainian forces, constrained by resources but liberated by necessity, leaned into that mismatch, turning it into an enduring advantage rather than a temporary surprise. Over time, the cumulative effect of these encounters reshaped not only tactics but attitudes, teaching soldiers on both sides that the margin between safety and catastrophe had narrowed dramatically. For tank crews, this meant accepting a permanent state of exposure, a realization that no amount of steel could fully insulate them from a battlefield defined by visibility and precision. For drone operators, it meant shouldering a different kind of burden, knowing that their actions carried strategic weight far beyond the immediate strike, influencing movement, morale, and planning across entire sectors. The relationship between hunter and hunted blurred, because both sides adapted continuously, each change prompting a counter-change in an ongoing cycle. Yet despite this dynamic equilibrium, the initial advantage conferred by speed and improvisation proved difficult to erase, because it was rooted in mindset rather than hardware alone. In retrospect, the early mockery of drones reads less like arrogance and more like a failure of imagination, an inability to envision how a small tool might scale through coordination and persistence. History is filled with such moments, where established powers dismiss emerging threats until evidence forces acknowledgement, and Ukraine's experience with FPV drones joined that lineage. The wrecks scattered along roads and fields became physical reminders of that lesson, silent testimonies to the cost of underestimation. Long after specific battles faded from memory, the broader implications endured, influencing how future conflicts would be approached and how new technologies would be evaluated. In that sense, the FPV drone's true legacy was not measured solely in destroyed tanks, but in the shift it compelled, a shift toward vigilance, humility, and constant adaptation. The laughter that once accompanied the sight of a buzzing drone vanished completely, replaced by a sober awareness that in modern warfare even the smallest signal can herald irreversible consequences, and that the line between dominance and disaster is thinner than ever. That awareness settled in gradually, shaped by repetition rather than revelation, and by the time it fully took hold, the environment in which armored units operated had been fundamentally altered. Movements were slower, pauses shorter, and trust in static defenses diminished, because nothing remained unseen for long. Ukrainian forces maintained pressure not by constant destruction but by constant presence, ensuring that the threat of attack was always plausible even when no strike occurred. This persistent uncertainty eroded confidence more effectively than any single catastrophic loss. Because it forced crews and commanders alike to second-guess every decision. In response, Russian units experimented with new formations, wider dispersion, and increased integration of infantry and electronic warfare, but these measures often traded one vulnerability for another, reducing speed or coordination and creating openings elsewhere. The balance between protection and effectiveness became increasingly difficult to manage, and every compromise carried risk. Ukrainian operators exploited these trade-offs with a patience that reflected hard-earned experience, choosing moments carefully and striking when impact would resonate beyond the immediate target. Over time, this approach created a feedback loop, where each successful attack reinforced caution on the other side, and that caution in turn generated new opportunities. For the soldiers involved, the war became less about decisive engagements and more about endurance, about sustaining focus and adaptability in an environment that punished routine and rewarded attention to detail. The FPV drone, once dismissed as a novelty, had become a catalyst for this transformation, reshaping not only tactics but the psychology of combat. Its influence extended beyond armor, affecting logistics, command relationships, and the tempo of operations across entire fronts. As future conflicts are studied and anticipated, the lessons drawn from these experiences will likely emphasize flexibility over rigidity and imagination over precedent. The story that began with laughter ended with a quiet reckoning, a recognition that modern warfare leaves little room for complacency and that the smallest innovations can carry consequences far greater than their size suggests. In the fields and roads of Ukraine, that truth was learned through loss and adaptation, and it stands as a reminder that the battlefield rewards those who are willing to see change coming before it arrives. In the months that followed, that reckoning became embedded in routine, shaping habits in ways that no formal order could mandate, and even when no drones appeared, the expectation of their presence influenced behavior. Crews learned to read the environment differently, to interpret silence as potential danger rather than safety, and to assume that any pause might be observed. This constant state of alertness was exhausting, but it was also unavoidable, because the alternative was complacency, and complacency had already proven fatal. Ukrainian forces continued to refine their use of drones not as isolated weapons but as part of an integrated system, linking reconnaissance, strike, and assessment into a seamless cycle that allowed them to apply pressure with remarkable efficiency. Each engagement fed data into the next, and each adaptation forced a response that could be studied and countered in turn. The result was an uneven but persistent advantage rooted in learning speed rather than sheer power. For Russian armored units, the challenge was not simply technical but cultural, because acknowledging vulnerability required questioning long-held beliefs about protection and dominance. That process was slow and uneven, and in some cases resisted outright, yet the battlefield offered no mercy for denial. Tanks continued to operate, to fight, and to matter, but they did so under a new set of constraints that limited their freedom and magnified their risks. The era when armor could advance with relative impunity had ended, replaced by a reality where every movement demanded justification and every halt invited scrutiny. Ukrainian operators understood that this shift alone justified their efforts, because even when no tank was destroyed, the mere possibility of attack shaped outcomes. Roads were avoided, advances delayed, and opportunities lost, all without a single explosion. In that sense, the FPV drone achieved an effect disproportionate to its size and cost, altering decision-making at levels far above the individual operator. As the war continued, these dynamics blended into the background of daily operations, no longer remarkable, but ever-present, a constant factor to be accounted for rather than a novelty to be feared or dismissed. The story that began with laughter thus concluded not with a single decisive moment but with a sustained transformation, one that illustrated how quickly the character of war can change when assumptions collide with reality. For those who experienced it firsthand, the lesson was indelible, and for those who study it from afar, it remains a powerful reminder that underestimating an enemy, especially one willing to adapt, is often the first step toward defeat.